Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Beyond its monuments, grand buildings, and vast green parklands lies another Washington, home to the torments and triumphs of generations of African American men and women. This other Washington, with both its dignity and its danger, has been largely unknown to its neighboring, more affluent precincts and the larger nation that is home to both. But in the masterful fiction of Edward P. Jones, the enormous variety and depth of this unknown world gains its rightful eloquence. With the same precise eye that gained him a Pulitzer Prize for his novel The Known World, Jones shows us yet again in the new collection All Aunt Hagar's Children that it is a powerful imagination that best conveys the language of the human heart. Edward P. Jones, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure, and we've had the pleasure of speaking on past occasions when you came up with great books, as you've done once again, and let me show everyone this wonderful collection of 14 short stories, All Aunt Hagar's Children. Ed, the book is dedicated to the multitudes who came up out of the South, principally, and among them your own mother, Jeanette, and your sister, and to whom all your books are dedicated, your mother. Washington is, in a very real sense, a powerful character in its own right, I thought, throughout these stories. There's kind of a pilgrimage to Washington in many of these accounts. And one of the first things I wanted to ask you is your sense of Washington as a place of destination and destiny. It seems to me it's pretty complex. Both good, nurturing, and benign things can happen here, and terrible, corrupt, destructive things as well.
Yeah, and that's the way I sort of saw things when I was growing up. Almost all the adults that I knew had been born and raised in the South, primarily Virginia and North and South Carolina. For the stories, I wanted, though, to have characters from many other states in the South. So I sort of fudged things and had people come from Georgia and Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas. But yeah, it was a different kind of place. Many different things. There's a character in the book that says the South is the best mother in the world and the worst mother in the world. Right. And I suppose D.C. is the same way for me. Well
said. In fact, in the very first story, in The Blink of God's Eye, we got people coming across from Virginia into Washington. I was very struck by that story right from the start. Aubrey and Ruth Patterson are the protagonists, and there's a little baby, a foundling, Miles, who gets introduced in this story. There are a couple of things about that story I wanted to ask you right away. The title, Aunt Hagar's Children, I thought was very powerfully reflected. I'm going to actually read the sentence in this story, and a kind of a theme that unites all the book. Hagar, in Genesis, was the mistress of Abraham, who bore his children when Sarah was barren.
Right.
And I think those children relate very powerfully to the story of the black race in the world and in this country. Here's the sentence, Ed, from that first story, In the Blink of God's Eye. They were the children of once upon a time slaves, born into a kind of freedom, but they had traveled down through the wombs with what all their kind had been born with, the knowledge that God had promised next week to everyone but themselves. I thought that really is at the heart of every one of these stories and all three books.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole sense of what I got from the people that I grew up with, you know. And most of them were very good people. But despite all of that, and because of what they'd gone through in this country, it was as if God didn't have his eye on them the way he had his eye on everyone else.
And that destiny was going to affect them and their children, and presumably at some point on Hagar's grandchildren. Great.
Yeah. The title comes from the phrase that my mother often used for black people, which was Aunt Hagar's Children. And that was the primary reason for using it. I have never read Uncle Tom's Cabin, but apparently there is a slave there called Hagar.
There is indeed. That's marvelous. Again, focusing on this first story, and this is a theme that I found repeated. Aubrey, the husband, is one of the people who I thought had his heart hardened, if you will, in his experience in D.C. Is that your sense of him? That
well, I'm not really sure, because the story takes place over about a year after their arrival from Virginia. I always saw Aubrey as his major problem was that he was with his father in his father's last days, and with his father's death and his marriage, Aubrey wanted to have a child, a boy, that he could name after his father. And along comes this infant that his wife finds hanging from a tree. And this comes between them over time.
Exactly.
And I think that the major problem for Aubrey is that he is a young man. He's not even 20. And he hasn't yet grown up. He loves his wife. He loves his wife very, very much, and I don't think he realizes how much. And perhaps he won't for some time.
But at the very end, I think the last words, I even wrote them down, I was so struck by them, his head was pained.
Yes.
There was this enduring pain that he suffers as a result of this episode.
Yeah, he is gone. His wife has, various times during the story, she goes home to take care of her ailing mother. And this final time, because she fears that Aubrey may do something to this infant that she's found. And she goes and leaves Washington for Arlington, presumably for the last time, and doesn't even tell him why she's going. He goes out one day and finds her chopping wood. She doesn't see him. And there is something about her independence, about the power of the smoke rising from the chimney, a fire she has made. There's something about the fact that the infant, she's tied to her back, and she is able to survive without him.
Well, that's the point. You know, now I feel a sense of my own discovery that these are all things in this new uncharted territory of Washington that were not part of their life in Virginia. Her independence, her growing, not separation physically, but the potential of it is frightening to him to some degree.
And he sees all of that, and he, rather than calling to her, he decides to go back to Washington, and the last line is, his heart was pained, and it was pain enough to overwhelm a city of men.
It's wonderful.
I should say here that the first story in Lost in the City is called The Girl Who Raised Pigeons.
And let me say what I think you're going to say, that Miles, the foundling, that's my very next question. Miles is in the Girl Who Raised Pigeons.
About 1955.
Exactly, as an adult. And he's the man who gives the pigeon, I think, to the little girl.
Exactly.
Now, here's the question that I had for you, because the first thing I thought when I saw Miles, that's the man who's going to do that later. You said, at least in one of your conversations, that every story, every book starts from the imagination afresh, and you called it, quote, a nasty job. It's just a tough thing to do. How does that connection work? That you get Miles and this story as a foundling, and then later as an adult? How does your imagination
I had never, it is, the imagination is just a weird, weird country. I had never once thought that I would go back to any of the characters or situations in Lost in the City. And then a strange thing happened. It was a few days after the Oklahoma City bombing, and I was watching some morning talk show, and they happened to have, I think her name is Gloria Gaynor, and she was singing. I had heard the song before, but it was the first time I could hear many of the words. She's famous for I Will Survive.
Exactly.
And I could hear all of those words, and somehow the woman in the title story, Lost in the City, the woman who goes with her friend and her friend's daughter to Israel and gets drunk there, this woman came to me, and I began to see her in her younger years in this abusive relationship with this man. And over the next weeks and months, other characters came to me, some of them minor, some major, and I began to form stories around them. With the first story in Lost in the City, The Girl Who Raised Pigeons, I thought about that one, and the person that I settled on was Miles. And I took it back 55 years to 1901 Washington. You know,
I'm so glad to hear you say this, because going back to our earlier conversations, I've always been struck by the way these stories get written in your mind, through your imagination, before they appear on paper. And you said at least 2 or 3 times in that answer, they came to me, the characters came to me.
You know, it just, there's an electric storm, I suppose, in the brain, and a character is there, and a storm goes off, and before you know it, you have a situation where the character is walking down the street or in a room having a conversation, and then you are simply compelled, pushed to create a world around that character, a story. And I learned with the known world that that the important thing for me, once that begins to happen, is to find a solution, a climactic moment that will end it all. So often, you know, people just sort of, the story just dies. They wake up one morning with a fine idea and they run with it without knowing the destination of the story.
Exactly.
You know,
listen, I'm sorry, I was going to say this, listening to you, the power of what you said, you have to write. You could not be anything other than a writer, could you?
It's too late for me to go down any other road. When I was young, I could take comic book characters and not trace them, but they would be here and I could draw them, you know, and I was very good at that. And then I hadn't done any of that since I was in my teens, and then in about 10, 15 years ago, a woman at the job I had wanted me to do a Garfield card for her son, and I found I couldn't do it, you know. Whatever talent I had for that was gone completely.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I was shocked, you know, and I shouldn't have been, because, you know, had I kept it up, maybe I would have been able to do it, but I was just surprised. It was as if I had done, you know, something had happened to me and I didn't know why it had happened, how.
Well, I'm glad what happened to you was led to these books, and want to see more of them. I want to talk more about characterization, Ed, and the climactic moment, to use a phrase you just used. I loved the characters in this. I had some favorites, and I want to talk about some of them. For example, in the story Resurrecting Methuselah, we're introduced to Anita Channing and her faithless husband, who's himself facing the trauma of cancer, actually. Breast cancer, which for a man is particularly disturbing. There's a moment in that story, and I want to focus on it. She goes to Hawaii en route to see him. Right. But in Hawaii, and this is the climactic moment, this thing you just mentioned, she buys candy. She remembers from childhood, but the taste of this candy is off-putting, sour or bitter or whatever. Yeah. And she makes a decision not to continue the trip.
To see her ailing husband.
I was struck by that, because and here's the crux of the question. It struck me that is a wonderful depiction of those moments when you use memory and experience and kind of a sense of lightning self-discovery. I mean, she didn't intend to break that trip off, ever. Yeah,
no. She leaves Washington on her way to Okinawa. And the thing, I've often said I'm never the best judge of my own work, but from questions that I've been getting over the last 2-3 years, I'm beginning to see certain insights. And I think one of the things I'm often interested in is that moment when a character grows up or becomes different. Anita, in that story, Resurrecting Methuselah, has spent many of her teen years sick, not going to school, not having any friends. So she's missed a great clump of childhood.
Right.
And she has gotten pregnant after she recovers and goes now to high school and gets involved with this man. They have a child and they marry. But there is this great thing that's missing. You know, we go from childhood into teens and into young adulthood, and we learn things about ourselves, and that is missing from her.
Well, let me carry that forward, and that's an excellent answer. And I love the way that what I took from that also is these conversations can help you. The questions you get can often lead to discoveries about your own process.
Yeah, because I mean, you know, it was something I heard a week or so ago. I mean, you write it, but you are not in it. You don't know it as well as someone who can come along with the more objective eye and say, yes, I see this, I see that. Because I think, for me at least, my concern always is with telling the best story that I can.
Right.
And I don't know all the time what tools I'm using to do that.
Well, that's actually wonderful for people like myself who are your readers, that we can have a sense of discovery of our own. In that same sense, one of my personal sense of discovery, one of my favorite characters is in Old Boys, Old Girls, Caesar Matthews, who I think appears also in other collections.
Yeah, he was in Lost in the City.
Yeah, And on that sense of self-discovery and the voids within a person, I found him a terribly sympathetic character.
Yeah.
Troubled. He's had a criminal past, but there's a sensitivity about him that I found deeply touching.
Yeah, that wasn't there in the first story in Lost in the City, in Young Lions. And also, I found also that I'm interested in people seeing a character and then making judgments and then finding out that, no, I was wrong about that. In one story, there's a guy on a bus and he's paying his fare with his pennies, and he's a fool in a way because he drops all the pennies and he's on the floor. And you would think, he helps this woman, and you would think that when she offers him some money that he would take it, but he doesn't. And the same thing because the story with Caesar Matthews, Old Boys, Old Girls, it opens saying that he had killed 2 people.
Right.
And so you expect certain things from that. And in the beginning, of course, those things are played out, but it's not at all the way the story ends. You would think.
But I think I got a special treasure for you at this moment, because of the way that you just phrased that. You want people to discover things in characters they didn't think were there at the start. I had a group of my friends read this book even as I read it, so we became kind of a community of readers. And I want to go to a story that I loved as well, and read you a quote from one of the readers and see if it gives you this same sense. The story is Bad Neighbors. And one of the protagonists is a young man named Derek. Now, just to characterize Derek in my own words, and I hope you agree, he is the kind of person, young man, that society typically sees as sullen and thuggish, a young black male, potential troublemaker, dangerous. A young woman reading that story, a friend of mine, had this reaction. I'll read you portions of it. While I was reading, I really did not care for him at all. But that all changed once I started to remember people that I know just like him. When Mr. Riccicelli delivered the bad news of his having to move, Derek showed a side of his concern for his family, not saying what I have to do. I felt then that his heart was bigger than his bite. Is that what you hope readers to do?
Yeah, and I think too, it's the way the world, of course, has seen black people in America. And even I've noticed that even sometimes with people who were born and raised in foreign countries, they come here and it's as if the first thing they learn is to see black people the way so many white people have seen black people. But yes, that's it exactly, because Derek, he never ever does anything that's wrong. It's always something done against him. Or when he hits this guy, it's right after the guy says something horrible about his mother.
That's exactly right.
So the viewpoint is always from the attitude of the neighbors who see him and make judgments before they even know who he is.
Right. You made a comment, and this leads to another one of the stories in this collection, that you hope to write in every instance, or your goal is to write short stories that have the reach of small novels, that have a novelistic quality. One of my candidates for that in this book is Common Law, where we get one incident of domestic violence on the street, and what I was struck by was the repercussions, like a pebble thrown into a stream.
Yeah, and then the first reaction comes with this little girl, who sees this woman being knocked down the stairs, and this horrible violence. A moment, and her reaction to it is to faint. And while the people on the street, Ridge Street, don't know it, but she is like the canary in the mine. This is the first sign of trouble. It hits her.
Right.
She. I was. The Ridge Street is every street in the book is a real place, and I lived for a time on Ridge Street. Although I have to make sure everyone knows that all the characters in the books are made up.
Right. I was certainly struck by Ridge Street and the power of that. And when you mentioned that you lived on every street that's reflected in this book, I found other echoes of your life too. For example, let me go to a story that's the favorite of many people I talk to, and one of mine too, and that's about Adam Robinson finding his grandparents. Yeah. Now, one of the reasons I think you dedicate your books to your mother is that she was such a wonderful person and obviously a great influence in your life, and you went through hard times.
Yeah.
And included 18 moves.
Yeah.
Now, that's 18 different places. Now,
and
Adam in this story is a little boy who has to go through foster homes.
Right.
And he's looking for this sense of security. And he finally discovers it, but it has to be in his own way. Would you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's a story in Lost in the City called My Mother's House, and Adam appears briefly. There's a drug dealer in there, and there's a woman who wasn't able to pay her bill, and she simply gives the kid, her child, away.
Right.
And then now the child, of course, with no parents, he's put through the system, and he's gone from home to home to home. So by the time you get to the story that's titled Adam Robinson,
Finds his grandparents, I think.
yeah, and a little sister.
And a little sister.
He has just been hardened, you know. He's 5, 6 years old, and his grandparents finally find him. And he's unable to believe that he will now have a permanent home.
That's right.
Because he's been so used to going from place to place. I'm not moved at all by things I read in the newspaper, but I suppose about 10 years ago, there was an article in the New York Times where they were talking about grandparents now having to take care of their grandchildren because the parents themselves have simply gone out of the picture.
Right.
And I think probably I just filed that away in my head. And when, after the first time Adam appears in the first story, Lost in the City, I suppose that came back to me, and I created a story around this little boy. Stories often, you cannot make a happy ending if the story doesn't lead that way.
That's right.
But I was so happy that I could give him this grandfather and grandmother and a little sister who love him.
I'm glad you did it, and I'm glad it came through his decision. And you know, all these decisions were made in his mind.
Yes.
These judgments based on what he'd known and had suffered.
Right.
That's really the magic of that story.
Yeah.
I just have to ask you this question. In a number of the stories in this collection and earlier collections, I get a sense of the intervention of the supernatural, the magical. The devil actually shows up in Safeway and swims the Anacostia and that kind of thing. It repeats itself as a theme so often in your stories. I'm wondering about your sense of this in life. Is this how to put it, these great unexplicable supernatural forces that can just sort of influence what happens to us?
Yeah, people are commenting that, well, you know, I'm following Marquez, you know, the magical realism thing, and I've said that black people have certain superstitions and notions about how the universe works. So that's what I'm following. You know, my mother, for example, believed that if on a street someone was killed and blood was spilled, that you could go back to that spot years and years later, and if it was raining, you could see the blood. Well, you know, when she said that, she said it with, as if she truly believed that. She had never herself gone to a place and found that to happen. But black people believe certain things.
Yeah.
And I don't believe them, but my job is to tell them with as much sincerity and feeling that's possible.
Much fidelity.
Yeah, and I'm not a religious person, but I often say that I'm doomed to write about people who are religious.
But you certainly do, and do it well. And the other thing you do, and I think it's the story about the root worker, is you contrast these two worlds. She restores the mental health of a mother whose own daughter is a physician. So you get this contrast between the scientific and the magical, so to speak.
Yeah, one of the things interesting with that story, root worker, is this idea that sometimes you can be educated to the point of losing common sense.
My grandmother used to say that. Maybe everyone's grandmother says that. And speaking of grandmothers and speaking of families, family is extremely important, not only in these stories and the earlier stories, the dedication of this book, all the way through, even the acknowledgments in the end. This is something that seems to be very important to you.
Yeah, well, for my mother, at least, that's whatever books I ever write will always be dedicated to her, because I think that if something had happened to her, if she had decided, you know, well, I am saddled with these 3 kids, one of them retarded, you know, I'll just leave them someplace, like Adam's mother left him, and go off and live a life of my own. But she didn't do that. I'm not sure, you know, probably would have ended up maybe like Adam. Maybe an aunt would have taken me and my sister in. But if I had to go through a system like he had gone through, I don't think I would have come out the way I am now. So I'm sitting here now with you because of my mother, and so it's a small thing to dedicate books to her.
You know, and I must say, as a reader, I hope this comes to you with the sincerity I mean it. That dedication deeply is affecting to me. I mean, I find it quite wonderful. It's inclusive. It makes you feel, you know, that this is meaningful to you, and therefore it's meaningful to all of us. That's wonderful. I have to ask you this, because the books to now, and I think the books in the future, are certainly going to have Washington as a great presence. Can you see yourself at any point perhaps doing another city or another place or another type of?
No, I don't see any reason to. I mean, if I had been born in Dallas or San Francisco and Seattle, you know, I would of course set the stories there. But Washington, you know, it's where I was born and raised, and I see no reason to put characters in Baltimore.
Right.
You know. Right. So and you know, it's so many of the stories take place in the 50s and 60s. You know, and to be able to say, you know, there was a store at 5th and O Streets, and I can remember going in there in the 50s, and there was a kerosene pump there, right there in the opening. It's the store in Lost in the City called The Store, the same store. I can't say that about some corner store in Baltimore. I can't say that about some corner store in Omaha.
Exactly.
You know, but I can. The problem now, of course, is that there's a movie called Avalon, and the guy says in there, if I had known it was all going to be gone, I would have remembered better. So my concern now is that things are disappearing.
Well, I'm sure glad you're keeping them alive for us, Edward P. Jones. Keep writing about Washington.
Thank you.
As a Washingtonian reader, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue's also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching. And thank you for talking, Ed. Thoroughly enjoyed it.